Welcome to the Chapter 28 lecture about fiscal policy. Let's start with a quick introduction. There are two types of policy government officials can implement. Monetary policy is changes in the money supply by the Federal Reserve. The Fed changes money supply in an effort to affect interest rates, which then impacts consumption and investment. Fiscal policy is concerned with the levels of government spending and taxation set by the President and Congress.
Fiscal policy affects economic behavior and aggregate demand in two ways. First, by a change in government purchases, G, and second, by a change in taxes, T. Let's first discuss the change in government purchases. When government spending increases, GDP increases, since GDP is the sum of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. If GDP is increasing, then the aggregate demand curve will increase and shift right. However, real GDP does not change by as much as the change in government spending for two reasons: the multiplier effect and crowding out. The multiplier effect is the extra shift in aggregate demand when an increase in government spending causes GDP to increase, which then causes consumption to increase. This can be explained in a two-step process. Effect 1 is straightforward. Government spending increases, say, by 100 billion. GDP increases by 100 billion. Effect 2 is the fact that consumers have newfound income due to the increase in GDP. Households will spend some of this new income and deposit a portion into the bank. The marginal propensity to consume, or MPC, is the fraction of extra income that a household consumes rather than saves. Since the MPC is greater than 0 for most households, the effect of government spending is magnified. The formula for the multiplier is 1 divided by 1 minus MPC. Here's an example. Remember the tax stimulus checks back in 2008? The government spent about $100 billion on those stimulus checks. Let's suppose the marginal propensity to consume is 3/4, meaning for every $4 a household gets, they consume 3 and save the other buck. The multiplier would be 1 divided by 1 minus 0.75, which equals 4. This means for every $1 the government spends, it has a magnified effect on GDP of $4. To determine the total effect of government spending, we can multiply the multiplier by the amount the government spent. In this case, we have 4 times 100 billion, resulting in a total impact on GDP of $400 billion. Let's look at the effect of the multiplier graphically. Price level on the vertical and real GDP on the horizontal. Let's start off with the aggregate demand curve and a fixed price level so we can see exactly how much GDP changes by. Effect 1 is the 100 billion increase in government spending, but the total effect of the consumption increase pushes the aggregate demand curve out to 82. Since we know that the total effect was 400 billion, we can say that 300 billion was due to effect 2, the increase in consumption spending. Crowding out works in the opposite direction of the multiplier effect. Rather than increasing aggregate demand, crowding out is the reduction in aggregate demand when government crowds out private investment due to higher interest rates. Remember the market for loanable funds discussed in Chapter 8. Interest rates on the vertical and the quantity of loanable funds on the horizontal. The demand curve represents borrowers and the supply curve represents savers. Saving comes from two sources, public savings and private savings. If the government spends money but runs a budget deficit to finance its spending, then public savings is negative and the supply curve will shift right. The result is a higher equilibrium interest rate. Since interest rates make borrowing more expensive, the quantity of loanable funds will decrease, as well as consumption and investment spending. A change in government spending, therefore, is ambiguous. It depends on which effect, crowding out or the multiplier, dominates. The second way fiscal policy affects economic behavior and aggregate demand is by changes in taxes. When the tax rates increase, consumption spending falls, which causes GDP to fall. If tax rates decrease, then consumption spending increases, which causes GDP to rise. Again, the total effect on aggregate demand depends on the multiplier and crowding out. Stabilization policies. When President Clinton was in office, he chose to raise taxes and reduce the budget deficit. This caused aggregate demand to decrease. In this scenario, what should the Fed do? They could offset the fall in aggregate demand by increasing money supply, therefore increasing aggregate demand. After both policies, the aggregate demand curve would be ineffective. Stabilization policy is when the Federal Reserve runs a policy opposite of fiscal policy, so the aggregate demand curve remains unaffected. The case for using policy to stabilize the economy. Its law. The Employment Act of 1946 stipulates that the goals of monetary policy is to promote full employment and price stability. The government should not cause economic fluctuations, and policy shifts should stabilize aggregate demand. The case against policy to stabilize the economy is policy shifts affect the economy with a long lag. Since investment decisions are made early, changes in interest rates only affect future capital and may take months to a year to really impact the economy. The political lag is associated with fiscal policy, since spending decisions go through both parts of Congress. Getting the House and the Senate to agree is not always easy. Automatic stabilizers are changes in fiscal policy that stimulate aggregate demand when the economy goes into a recession, without policymakers having to take any deliberate action. Automatically, taxes fall. Since we have a progressive tax system, as incomes decrease, people fall into lower tax brackets and pay less taxes. If people view this as a tax cut, then the aggregate demand curve will increase. Automatically, government spending will rise. Benefit payments rise during a recession and stimulate aggregate demand. Examples of benefit payments include unemployment compensation and welfare. Automatic stabilizers on their own are not sufficiently strong enough to prevent recessions. However, without them, output and employment would probably be much more volatile.
This is the end of the Chapter 20 lecture on aggregate demand. If you have any questions about the key concepts from this chapter, please send me an email or post a question in the Ask Professor Pakula discussion board.